All right, this is Mr. Peterson with the second screencast for Unit 2 in AP Environmental Science. In this chapter, we're learning about biodiversity. First up, biodiversity is the sum total of all the variety of life on Earth. It comes in 4 different flavors, and the one that comes to most people's mind is species diversity. That's the total number of different species living in an area. The next kind is genetic diversity. Almost all of life on Earth is based on DNA, and each species contains different genes that make them unique. That variety of genetic information has allowed life to survive on Earth through many changes over hundreds of millions of years, and it is the key to surviving in the future. This is a picture of a Florida panther, and although they've come back a bit, at one point their entire population on Earth was limited to about 20 individuals. That means they have very low genetic diversity because the ones alive today are all descendants of those 20, and they have some problems as a result of that, including heart failure. The next type of diversity is ecosystem diversity, the variety of forests, grasslands, mountains, wetlands, and deserts that make up the Earth's biomes. These areas house vastly different types of organisms, and they shift and cover different areas of the Earth as the Earth's climate changes. Because of the diversity of different biomes and the way they each work, ecosystem diversity supports the next type of biodiversity. And that's functional diversity. Each ecosystem and species in each ecosystem completes different services for the Earth, and that we couldn't possibly duplicate those services with all the technology and money in the world. This beaver dam, although some say is a nuisance, actually cleans the water that flows through it. By forcing the water to slow down and be still behind the dam, many types of pollution that the water carries, like sediment, settle to the bottom, leaving the water that flows through the dam much clearer than it would be otherwise. Biodiversity is important for us as humans because it supplies us with raw materials to support our economies, medicines that protect our health, and also disposes of waste and pollution that we generate. It does all of that for free, as long as we don't use up too much of it at one time. Species diversity mostly. How did we get to this state where we have so many different kinds of species? The answer is biological evolution. Biological evolution is the process where life on Earth changes due to the changes in the genes of a population of individuals. The theory of natural selection was first proposed by Charles Darwin back in the 1800s. And remember here that when we use the word theory in science, it's not the same thing as everyday theory. Like I have a theory why giving sugar to 4-year-olds makes them hyper. Scientific theories are the result of repeated experimentation, and they represent the best tested explanations for the way the world works around us. Darwin's idea of natural selection stated that some individual members of a population possess traits that make them better suited for the environment around them, and that they would reproduce more often and in greater numbers, leading to those traits becoming more widespread. It works like this. First up, the original ancestor has offspring, 3 in this picture, and mutations that occur randomly as a result of DNA copying errors creates variation in those offspring. Those mutations are random, and about 99% of the time, those mutations are detrimental to the organism. Occasionally, mutations produce new traits that result in an offspring that is better suited to the environment than others. Those beneficial traits that can be passed on through heredity are called adaptations, and they lead to differential reproduction. You can see in the diagram here that this individual ends up leaving more descendants after a few generations than those 2 did. That's differential reproduction. Individuals who possess beneficial adaptations end up having more offspring that also share those traits, either because they lived longer themselves and had more opportunities to have offspring, or they had more offspring at one time than others around them. Either way, the population changes over time as those descendants make up a greater and greater proportion of the population. All well and good. Natural selection tends to result in populations of organisms that are very close or are fit for their environment. Like the praying mantis 2 slides back that was well camouflaged under his habitat. But what happens when the environment changes? Sometimes it can result in further adaptation by natural selection. This is a picture of one type of bacteria. And if you were to be infected with them, you'd go to the doctor and get a prescription for some antibiotics. You take the antibiotics, and from the first dose, you'd be changing the environment inside of your body to make it very inhospitable to the bacteria. You might be infected with millions of bacteria, but after the first dose of antibiotics, 95% of them would die. After another day, another 95% of those. After 3 or 4 days, you would have killed almost every last bacteria in your body. But a few, the ones that had the most natural DNA given resistance to that bacteria, would still be clinging to life. If you took every last dose of the medicine, eventually they'd be wiped out 100%. Is that many people after 3 or 4 days start to feel better. So they tend to forget to take all of their medications because they're feeling better, right? When those last few bacteria survive and start reproducing, they pass on their resistant genes to all of their descendants. And presto, now you've got a bacterial infection again, but this time it's made of millions of bacteria that are all resistant to the original antibiotic. Taking the same dose of the same antibiotic this time won't work. You'd have to take a stronger dose, possibly damaging your body, or switch to a different antibiotic that the bacteria aren't resistant to. The problem is the bacteria are faster at evolving than we are at coming up with new antibiotics. The key here is that species can adapt to their new environment under 2 conditions. 1, they have enough time, and 2, they already possess the genetic diversity that gives some members the ability to survive in that new environment. If no members of a population possess any pre-existing variations, then they can also migrate and move to an environment that suits them better, or they can simply go extinct. This is the dodo bird, comically named as such because they were found only on a few uninhabited islands in the Pacific. Sailors stopping on the island could easily walk up to them, they're about the size of a turkey, and club them, taking them back to the ship to eat. The birds went extinct because so many of them were killed in such a short period of time, and none of the ones that survived the first few years of this had any hint of fear of humans. So they didn't have time to adapt to humans, and then the last dodo bird was killed and eaten. And that was it for the dodos. That brings up the limits to evolution. Natural selection can only work with variations that are pre-existing in populations. So you can't dream up scenarios where radically different changes are going to occur to a species in a short period of time. Each step along the way, every mutation that results in an adaptation, has to benefit the organism right then and there, or perhaps be neutral in effect for the present time. The other limit to evolution is that it takes time to occur, because, again, individuals don't evolve, populations do. That means for evolution to occur, organisms have to reproduce, with those most suited for the environment doing a greater share of it. If a species reproduces very slowly, they may not be able to adapt quickly at all. Now, for the 3 myths about evolution by natural selection. The first one is that it's the survival of the fittest. It's true, but all things in science, it takes a bit of understanding to see what that means. Fitness in science isn't measured in muscle tone, speed, or fighting ability. Fitness is measured by one thing, the number of offspring you have during your lifetime. If you're like the deer here, the first one to flee in an alarm with your tail up, you may have the highest fitness of all of your population because you live the longest by not getting shot. The next myth about evolution by natural selection is that organisms want or need to change. The fact of the matter is that adaptations are a result of mutations, and most of those mutations are detrimental. Organisms can't dream up something they want and try to adapt. It just doesn't work that way. Last up, there's no evolutionary master plan. Organisms present today have a very tight fit with their environment, but it's not really predictable in which way things are going to go for the future. This frog sitting on a rock attracts mates by croaking. But if frogs of this species had mutations that increase the volume of their offspring croaks, that might not be a good thing like it might first seem. If it attracts bats that can now hear you from further away, then you're going to survive less than the quieter frogs around you. And you're going to leave less offspring. Oh, and your croak stays normal. But a new predator species migrates into your population, and their ears are specialized already for hearing your particular croak. You're going to croak as a species. There's no master plan in evolution. There's only who's well adapted enough to stick around today and leave some offspring behind. If the environment changes, all bets are off. Now, geological processes, like having the tectonic plates of the Earth moving around, have provided lots of opportunities for the environment to change around species. Moving around 1 centimeter per year, the continents have moved together and broken apart several times throughout history. This does two things. First up, it separates populations of the same species as a landmass splits apart. And that's important in a minute. It also changes the environment around those species on a piece of land. If you drill deep enough beneath the snow and ice on Antarctica, there are fossils of tropical plants buried deep underground. Why? Because that landmass used to be much more tropical millions of years ago. The slow pace of change does allow time for mutations to produce enough variation to allow species to adapt. But again, they don't have to. Plenty have gone extinct. More rapid changes have occurred through climate change, seen here in the picture of how many ice covered the northern hemisphere in the last ice age. The change in global temperatures pushed many species south, and that changing environment resulted in many changes to species during that time. But again, they didn't have to adapt, need to adapt, or want to adapt. The species we have here today are a result of the ones that managed to live because of the traits they already possessed when change came. Natural catastrophes like asteroid impacts and massive volcano eruptions have also resulted in huge changes to Earth's life in very short periods of time, sometimes killing off as much as 95% of the species on Earth. So now that we know a bit more about evolution by natural selection, exactly how does one species become two species? It happens through the process of speciation. Generally, it requires geographic isolation, where one population becomes separated geographically from another population of the same species. In the picture here, an original fox population becomes separated into two. It could be because some members of the original population migrated away. It could be because the original population was blown from one island to another. Think Darwin. The point is, it doesn't matter how they get separated. It matters that they are now separated from each other. Given enough time, and different mutations are going to build up in each of the separated populations. And over time, each population will become different from the other. If at some point members of the two populations were to encounter each other, and they couldn't breed and produce fertile offspring, then you'd have two species at that point. They may not recognize each other as potential mates, or they might attempt to mate and only be able to reproduce sterile hybrids. The point is that time they'd been reproductively isolated because they couldn't breed together and produce fertile offspring. Changing environment, speciation is one way that things can go. Extinction is just as likely, where all members of a particular species cease to exist. If change is too rapid, there's nowhere else to go, or whatever. When the last member of a species is gone, it's extinct. This is a highly likely for endemic species, like this golden toad, which is extinct. It was only found in one small area of forest in Costa Rica. Non-endemic species have higher resilience to extinction because if the members in one population go extinct, they may be replaced later by members of the same species migrating from other populations later. There's a normal amount of extinction going on in the reign of chance and natural changes to the environment, and it's called the background extinction rate. Periodically, much higher extinction rates came about due to catastrophic, widespread changes like I mentioned earlier. Those mass extinctions. Give an example of one of them. Around 65 million years ago, most of the dinosaurs became extinct because of a large asteroid that hit the Earth near the Gulf of Mexico. It threw up so much dust and debris that the sun's light would have been blocked enough to seriously reduce photosynthesis, and that set up a whole cascading set of changes to all species on Earth. This picture is from a layer of rock that can be found all over the Earth, and it's made of the dirt and dust that settled back to Earth after the asteroid impact. Another slide of it again. It's the light-colored layer, and it can be found all over the world in rocks of the same age. Back to diversity. Species diversity is a measure of how many different species are present in an area. There are two ways to measure it. First up, species richness is simply a count of the number of species in an area. Species evenness is a measurement of the number of species too, but it includes the relative abundance of each species as well. So this coral reef would rank high in species richness and it would rank very high in species evenness because there are only a few members of each kind of species. No one species dominates. Contrast the coral reef with this image of a forest. It has low species richness because there is only one species that can be easily seen. It's likely there are a few others that can't be seen in this picture, but it would rank low on species evenness because there are so many of one type of species that dominate the ecosystem. This is important for sustainability because ecosystems that are more species diverse can be more productive and more resilient when faced with changes. Because there are so many different species present in areas with high species diversity, chances are some of them will be able to survive even dramatic changes to the ecosystem. Now, moving on. We've just got a few more ideas to take care of. The niche of a species describes where it lives in the environment and the roles that it plays in the ecosystem. Just looking at where a species lives in the habitat. For example, these lichens grow on a rock, have a simple habitat. It's the rock. Lichens are actually a mutualistic mix of fungus and some algae living together, and their niche is interesting. They can live on bare rock, as you can see, and as the lichens grow, the algae performs photosynthesis, while the fungus anchors the algae down, keeps it moist, and supplies it with minerals by breaking down the rock. Over time, bits of the lichen die and break off, and they fall down into cracks in the rock and degrade over time to form soil. That soil builds up, and given enough time, there's enough there to support actual plants. So the niche of lichens is to colonize bare rock and set up a chain of events that forms soil for plants to grow in. Pretty neat. By the way, why did the fungus and the algae get married? Because they took a liken to each other. Now moving on. There are several types of roles that species play in their ecosystem. First up are generalist species, like this cockroach. Generalist species have broad niche, meaning they can survive in a variety of different habitats, eat a wide variety of foods, and can tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, which contrasts with specialist species. They can only exist in very narrow niche, like this koala bear. Specialist species need a very specific set of environmental conditions or a very specific kind of food, or a very specific kind of habitat in order to survive. Specialist species are much more likely to go extinct when faced with environmental changes than generalist species are. Native species are species that have always existed in an area, while non-native or exotic species are those that have been introduced to an area where they weren't previously found. It can be accidental or deliberate that they were there. And sometimes exotic species are called alien species, and they're called invasive if they reproduce quickly and have no natural controls on their population in the new environment. Next up is indicator species. Indicator species are like the proverbial canaries in a coal mine. Their presence or absence reveals a lot about the health of an ecosystem. Finding this trout in a stream is a sign of very high water quality because if there was any kind of pollution present, the trout would have died or migrated away. There are indicator species that are present in high numbers in polluted ecosystems too. So knowing which kinds of species indicate what can tell you a lot about the status of an ecosystem without a single chemical test or measurement. So keystone species are any species that have a large effect on the other species in their environment. Definitely more than their own abundance would indicate. The stone right here in the arch over this window is called a keystone because its unique shape helps make the arch much stronger than it would be if the arch was just made of solid brick. This sea otter is a keystone species because having only a few of them around in a bay keeps the ecosystem balanced. This one just swam to the bottom of the bay and picked up 3 sea urchins, the purple spiky clumps, and is now bashing them with rocks to open them up and eat the meat inside. Without the sea otter, the sea urchins naturally crawl around the bottom of the bay, and one of the things they eat is kelp, like those seen here. The thing is, the sea urchin can only eat the bottom end of the kelp, so when it's cut off, the rest floats to the top of the water. After that, no sunlight gets through the water, so new kelp can't grow from the bottom up, and that's positive feedback. A small change accelerates into larger and larger changes until eventually all life in the bay suffers. Sea otters play a keystone role because just having a few of them around to keep the sea urchin's population in check, preventing all of the kelp from dying. And that benefits the entire ecosystem, keeping things stable for all other fish and living organisms. Last up is foundation species. Foundation species are like ecosystem engineers. They're actually sets up a whole host of changes that change habitats to benefit other species. The beaver takes a small stream and dams it up, creating major changes to the ecosystem that result in new habitats for fish, ducks, aquatic plants, and other species. And that's it for now. Thanks for watching.